Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Kaufman, Executive Vice President and COO at Newark Regional Business Partnership, and I'm delighted to welcome you on this stormy afternoon to our inaugural installment of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Mini-Series on racial and economic disparities. We're very excited to be able to present this series, and we think we've got a great program to start with the person who I think is the most knowledgeable of anyone that I know in terms of this topic. So more to come on that. A little bit of background and logistics before we get started. We have two more programs coming up that are not part of this series. Tomorrow we will be talking about marketing with one of our member firms, 3EPR. And what I will say in introducing that program is that now is not the time to shy away from marketing. This is the absolutely perfect time to be doing marketing, and you really want to be out there. There's a lot of statistics on how companies that are marketing now end up coming out of whatever crisis is happening in much better shape. So please do tune in for tomorrow. There's still time to register. The following week, we're going to be hearing from Citrin Cooperman about cybersecurity. Also a very important topic now with everyone working remotely. There's that many more exposures that are possible, so you'll want to tune into that as well. The logistics for today, all of you will have your cameras off and muted for the entire duration of the program. There is a questions box, and we invite you to pose your questions there. Around 2:45, Ryan will pause, and I'll take a look to see if there are questions, and if there are, I will pose them. I also want to bring your attention to the chat box, which is below the questions. And in the chat box, Maya Curry, who is our communications director and is also leading our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion initiative, will put notes. What's already in there is a link to a reference that was provided by NJISJ, and there's also a PDF in the handout section. So watch that periodically for anything that may be relevant as we go along. But again, the questions go in the questions box. At the, as I said, at the 45 or 50 mark, I'll come back on if there are questions, and then Chip Halleck, our president and CEO, will close the program. Now, just a little bit of background for today as we begin. We have been undertaking a diversity series for the past 3 years, and we felt that now was an excellent time to focus on racial and economic disparities and to engage the business community in meaningful change. The COVID epidemic and recent national incidents of police misconduct have exposed cracks and heightened awareness of the deep economic, racial, disability status, healthcare disparities throughout our country. We hope that through our work as a Chamber of Commerce, we can create understanding, tolerance, equitable business practices and public policy, meaningful innovation, and particularly to influence the business community. We have 3 additional programs in this series. On August 18th, we will be reimagining law enforcement and mending community police relations, and we will be joined by one of Ryan Hagood's team members, Andrea McChristian, who is the Law and Public Policy Director at NJISJ. She will be joined by Will Simpson, Equal Justice, Deputy Chief Brian O'Hara from the Newark Police Department, Solomon Williams from the Newark Community Street Team, and Independent Monitor Peter Harvey. That will be 12 p.m. on August 18th. We have 2 remaining programs in the series, and I'll mention it again, but we're grateful to Quest Diagnostics for sponsoring this series. The 2 remaining programs will be on economic development, Hire, Buy, Live, What's Next, and also education and healthcare, exploring critical needs. We're very grateful to Quest Diagnostics for sponsoring this series and for much more that they do, and also to our media sponsor, NJ Advanced Media. We appreciate the guidance of today's speaker, Ryan Haygood. When we first proposed doing this series, our sit down with Ryan was what led us to frame out the 4 components, and we're very grateful to you, Ryan, for your sound advice. I encourage everyone to regularly look for the emails from NJISJ, to go to the website and to find out how you can be active, and that handout that we've attached helps you to do that, how you can be active in the work of NJISJ. Ryan is going to take us through the cracks in the foundation that have been exacerbated by COVID, and he will help us to explore systemic racism, anti-Blackness, class disparities, and much more. To get us started today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Kerry Kennedy, who is Executive Sales Director for New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania at Quest Diagnostics. So I am going to leave you for the next few minutes, and I will come back towards the end, 45 or 50 mark, Ryan, to pose any questions if there are any. Kerry, it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to be joining you all today, and certainly to be a part of an organization that has chosen to sponsor an important series event like this one. The New York community has an incredibly special place in my heart, as I grew up spending weekends at my grandmother's house in the Vailsburg section of Newark, where my mother was born and raised. As we all know, some of New Jersey's best restaurants are in Newark, and my family and I have celebrated many milestones here. I understand that you had a diversity luncheon series, which we actually had a similar event at Quest Diagnostics. So it seems that a few of our activities are certainly aligned. As a Quest Diagnostics employee for almost 14 years, we celebrate our team more like a family than co-workers. We pride ourselves on inclusion, and a lot of that comes from what our main mission is, which is truly patient care. Most recently, having partnered with the Newark school districts and an upcoming NAACP testing event, we're doing all that we can to make sure that all patients have access to testing. We're looking forward to hosting additional events and getting to know your community more intimately, as our home base is right here. Quest Diagnostics headquarters and our building of the largest laboratory in the country will be in northern New Jersey, serving our neighbors as patients, so this is obviously important to us. I am pleased and honored to introduce Ryan Haygood, Esquire, President and CEO of New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the 20-year-old Newark-based organization dedicated to creating just, vibrant, and inclusive communities throughout New Jersey. Mr. Haygood has led an institute since 2015, and he uses his national legal expertise to advance the institute's working in empowering New Jersey's urban communities. Prior to joining NJISJ, Mr. Haygood served as the Deputy Director of Litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. We encourage you to visit njisj.org to learn more. With that, Ryan, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kerry, for the generous introduction. I'd like to thank Chip, Barbara, and Maya for putting together this program and for the thoughtful way they constructed it, such that it's a series of conversations. I think they really capture this moment that we're in. And my charge, as I understand it, from Maya, from Chip, and from Barbara, is to really sort of talk about some of the foundational challenges, some of the cracks we're seeing in our foundation that are causing real earthquakes in communities of color, in Black, Latino, and other communities of color. So I love to share just a bit about how we've been thinking about the moment. And then I love to leave enough time for us to have some interaction, for you to ask questions that may come to mind that you've been thinking about as well. I want to thank you all for joining us. I know that we're in the throes of a lot of things, right? In the throes of the coronavirus pandemic, we have experienced a lot of trauma in our communities and on TV with respect to law enforcement's violent acts toward often unarmed Black people and other people of color. And then today we're in a state of emergency around the weather. So as I'm speaking to you, it looks like the sun is coming out a little bit here in Newark, which I think is a good omen. So as was mentioned by Kerry, my name is Ryan Haygood. I have the real privilege and honor of leading the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We are an advocacy organization whose mission really is to identify what we think of as structural, load-bearing walls of inequality, that if we topple them, will open up opportunities for people of color in our cities across New Jersey in a way that can serve as a model for the country. Really, really proud of the work we do here, focusing on racial disparities and trying to understand what they tell us and what they don't tell us, and how we need to build systems to interrupt those disparities. Really proud of the fact that our team is a majority woman of color team with some of the best talent that is out there, national level talent. And my own leadership style is I empower the team to do the work. I just try to get out of the way after casting a vision around what we do. So I want to speak to you a bit about this moment, sort of how we got here, and then what I think we are to do in it. And I've been thinking a lot about this moment is sort of both a painful moment, but also a precious moment. A painful because of all that we've experienced that I don't have to tell you more about, but precious because I think very often, as we all know, progress happens in most painful moments like these. And so I want to ask Maya if you would show the first slide here on the subject of the painful moment. So for those of you who've not seen it, I encourage you to take a look at the June edition of the New Yorker magazine. One of my dear friends, Jelani Cobb, has an article in this edition. I was really struck by this image. So obviously this is the outline of George Floyd. And then in his body is kind of a snapshot, if you will, of sort of Black history. At the very bottom, you'll see those are folks who were enslaved and brought across the Atlantic Ocean as enslaved people on slave ships. To the right of that, of those folks in the bottom, you see that gentleman, his name is Gordon. And the story about Gordon was that he escaped from the South to the North and was returned. And what is on his back is a function of his attempt to escape. But I'm 45 years old, and what struck me probably most in this image, this powerful image, is if you look in the middle, right in the middle, right where the heart would be, you'll see it looks like a white automobile with several people around the person who's on the ground, and that white automobile is a Hyundai. That date was March 3rd, 1991, and that gentleman on the ground is Rodney King. And so I came of age in this era where Rodney King's beating between 56 and 59 times, depending on how you count, beating by the batons of 4 white police officers about his head, shoulders, back, just a brutal beating. It was captured on camcorder video. And for those of you who remember this Rodney King beating, you'll also remember that those 4 police officers were acquitted on state charges of all charges. And it took a federal investigation before 2 of the 4 officers were ultimately convicted of federal civil rights violations. And I was captured by this image because we are having a very similar conversation about police brutality of unarmed Black folks in 2020. And there are so many people captured in this image. When I spoke about this recently, I was at an event where a gentleman spoke to me about the image to the right of Rodney King, that is Emmett Till. And he said that when he was a young person, Emmett Till was lynched. And so this is not a new conversation, right? There's a theme in this country that keeps us focused on these kinds of incidents and these kinds of stories. And I want to talk a bit about why that is. So if you would turn to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. And so this is part of a publication we just produced. Maya provided the link to the document in the comments, but this is, as you see, a young man with his hands on the straps of his backpack, and he's standing on a foundation, and the foundation you see is cracked. And here at the organization that I lead, the Institute for Social Justice, we think a lot about how these cracks in our foundation are causing real earthquakes in communities of color, in Black and brown and other communities of color in particular. And the cracked foundation is caused by structural racism, that our foundation, our society's foundation here in New Jersey and across the country is cracked by structural racism. And it's through those cracks that our communities are experiencing real earthquakes. And I want to just talk to you a bit about, so what does that mean concretely, Ryan? You talk about cracks in our foundation. Let's talk about how you unpack how the cracks manifest themselves. And so we put together, if you could turn to the next slide, Maya, this image here. And as I mentioned to you, here at the organization I lead, the Institute of Social Justice, we do a lot of work around looking at New Jersey's racial disparities. And we are at once a state that is one of the most racially diverse states in the country. I think we're the second most racially diverse state behind California. But we're also one of the most racially segregated states. New Jersey is one of the wealthiest states in the country, I think second only to Maryland. But we've also got a state where this incredible wealth exists alongside really punishing poverty. And so New Jersey is an interesting state where we've got incredible wealth alongside incredible poverty, incredible racial diversity alongside some really extreme racial discrimination and residential discrimination and discrimination in our schools. And so in some ways, we really are kind of what Dr. King talked about more than 50 years ago when he talked about the two Americas, right? There's this phenomenon where you have two Americas inside of one country, and people experience the country differently depending on how they're positioned in it. So I just want to share a few statistics that sort of highlight these racial disparities from this image. So here again is a young boy, and he's at the bottom of a staircase, and he looks ahead. This is sort of the Black experience in New Jersey. He looks ahead to see what the numbers tell him, right? This idea that, you know, the numbers are real. They don't lie to us. He looks ahead at the numbers, and I just want to focus you on a couple. So the second, if you look at the second step around this idea of the racial wealth gap, I mentioned to you that New Jersey is one of the wealthiest states in the country. It is. It's in New Jersey that the median net wealth for New Jersey's white families is $352,000. This is the highest net worth of anyone in the country. White families in New Jersey, $352,000, highest in America. But if you look to the right of that $352,000 number, you'll see that the median net wealth for Black families is $6,100 and $7,300 for Latino families. Incredible racial wealth gap. $352,000 white families, highest in America. $6,100 for Black families. And I want to talk about sort of where that comes from, but I want to focus you on a couple more. So if you move up one more stair, you'll see the number 1 in 5. So that means that Black people account for 1 in 5 coronavirus-related deaths in New Jersey, even though Black folks make up just 15% of the overall population. And there are folks who say, well, that's because Black folks suffer from some of the underlying conditions on which COVID-19 preys. And that is true. But I think what we've learned in the coronavirus pandemic is that the real underlying condition is structural racism. And we'll talk more about that. And then I just want to walk up just one more stair. There are many other stairs we can walk up, but for purposes of our conversation, I just want to focus you on these three. So the third one is 21 to 1. This racial disparity says that in New Jersey, a Black child is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white child. 21 times, 21 to 1. Highest Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the country in New Jersey. Here's the thing though, the research shows that Black and white kids commit most offenses at about the same rate. So the racial disparity, the 21 to 1, doesn't reflect actual participation in crime. What that number reflects is that we have vastly different responses when young white kids do things that young kids do versus when kids of color do those things. So that today in New Jersey, a state of 9 million people, there are 8 white kids in prison. 8, so sub 10, 8 white kids in prison, and the rest are Black and Latino. Now here's the thing, this is not me advocating for us to incarcerate more white kids, to be sure, but it is evidence of the way in which we treat Black, white, brown kids very, very differently. And so today in Governor Murphy's budget, New Jersey is spending $300,000 to incarcerate Black and brown kids. Very specific investment in incarcerating Black and brown kids. Many of you all know that my wife, Charity, is the principal of Avon Avenue School here in the city of Newark, a K-8 district school. And I often think about what she and her colleagues, what educators could do with an investment of $300,000 a year in their kids, right? Think about that. We make investments, incredibly deep investments in incarcerating kids, but those same investments are not made on the front end. And part of the reason why the racial disparity is so high is because we make investments there. So that if you invest in incarceration and targeted incarceration, you will no doubt have the numbers we have, which is part of what drives the highest Black to white youth, and also, as you see in the first step, adult incarceration disparity rates in the country here in New Jersey. I want to quickly unpack, before I move to the next slide, the racial disparity number. So I was speaking about this number recently, about New Jersey's racial wealth gap, to some folks on a campus, and there was a gentleman, a middle-aged white gentleman in the front of the audience, and I could see he was having a visceral reaction to the numbers. It's understandable because these numbers are staggering. And when you look at them, you try to make sense of them, right? And so there's this tendency to bring your own interpretation to the numbers, as he did. So I shared with him, the number I shared with you, that the median net wealth for white families in New Jersey, $352,000, highest in America, but it's just $6,100 for Black families. And I could see him having a reaction to the numbers, and I anticipated he'd be the first one to ask a question, and he was. His hand shot up. I invited him to ask his question, and he started by saying, you know, that number can't be right, right? So, and this is common, right? So to resist the numbers, to resist the math, because the numbers are so staggering, how could they be real? And I pointed him to a report that we just wrote called Erasing New Jersey's Red Lines. This is a report that talks about where New Jersey's racial wealth gap comes from, that it was actually conceived in slavery here in New Jersey, that slavery took root very, very deeply here, that New Jersey was one of the early colonies that gave more than 100 acres of land to those who came from England to settle here, and it required enslaved Black folks to work on that land. Talked about that. That New Jersey's racial wealth gap today was conceived of in slavery, and it was reinforced by policies, practices, laws that ensured we see it as we do today, that there's a through line from slavery in New Jersey to today's racial wealth gap. That's just the truth, right? So slavery comes to an end. A form of sharecropping emerges here in New Jersey. When sharecropping comes to an end, restrictive covenants are used to preclude Black folks from owning land. When sharecropping comes to an end, you see restrictive covenants come to an end, redlining emerges, and whole cities are created inside of red lines. So we know what those ultimately look like. So I shared this piece of history with him around where the numbers came from. They came from Prosperity Now, a credible national organization. So he says he fired. So he credits the number, $352,000, white families' highest net worth in the land, $6,100 for Black families. So he now is comfortable with the data, the source, Prosperity Now. So then the second argument is, well, then the reason it's so low for Black people, and then comes sort of the personal responsibility argument. He then begins to argue that the number's so low for Black people because, and then sort of the parade of horribles attaches. Black people are allergic to wealth, right? There's something deficient in our DNA. We don't work hard, and when we do work hard and get money, we don't save it. The reason the number is so low, he argued, for Black families, $6,100, is because there's something wrong with Black families, right? There's something wrong with Black families. And then his third argument came. And I respected him for articulating this third point, which he said was, and listen, I'm a white man, and my net wealth is not $352,000. And I paused. Again, I appreciated that he had such candor in sharing this, although I was surprised. And I said, you know, that is a personal failure, right? somewhat in jest, but there's a serious point here. I know it's cold-blooded, which is that there has been no systematic effort to separate white people from wealth in New Jersey, as we've seen with Black people. The reason the racial wealth gap is so vast, the reason why the median net wealth is so low for Black people is because there have been systemic efforts that have been successful to separate Black people from wealth. The reason it's so high for white families is because there are systems that connect white people to wealth in the state. And the primary driver of wealth, as we all know, is home ownership. And so we spend a lot of time here at the Institute looking at these racial disparities, understanding where they come from, how these racial disparities reflect real cracks in our foundation. And it's through these cracks that Black and brown and other communities of color experience real earthquakes in the racial wealth gap, earthquakes in the Black to white youth and adult incarceration disparity rates, earthquakes in school and as residential segregation, earthquakes in the administration of health care. Earthquakes in every direction are caused by the deep cracks in our foundation. And so then the question for us, for the business community, right, for those of us who have businesses here, who've made deep investments in here, who live here, who love here, is what do you do? What do you do with a foundation that's cracked, that produces these kinds of racial disparities? What do you do with those? Well, very often we do direct services, right? We respond in emergency moments with direct services. And what I want to suggest is that where you have systemic failures, as we have here, reflected in our cracked foundation, you have to respond with systemic responses. You have to work on policies, practices that fill in those gaps, that create new foundations. There's been a big push by some for us to return to normal. You hear this from some folks. I just can't wait to get back to normal. And I suggest to you that we should reject normal, because this graph here is normal New Jersey. And I think what we ought to be championing is, how do we build a new normal? So I want to ask Maya, if you would turn to the next slide to tell a quick story about my wife, Charity. So you find her here in the front on the right side. She's holding a computer. She's joined by her colleagues here at Avon Avenue School. And I love this photo. This photo was captured after a gentleman named Michael Rowe, who used to host a show called Dirty Jobs. I don't know if you've seen it. Great show. He now hosts a show called Returning the Favor. And Mike Rowe learned that Charity and her colleagues here at Avon Avenue School, after Superintendent Leon encouraged the administrators, the principals, to get their kids computers so they could learn at home, learn remotely during the pandemic, Mike Rowe learned that Charity and her colleagues were delivering computers to their kids' homes, right? And the superintendent's charge was, we got to get them out quickly so they can, so that we don't lose so much time, so they can learn at home, learn remotely, because they're probably going to be there for a while, as we've seen. This is back in March. And so Charity and her team quickly distributed all the computers they have. And fortunately, they're able to get one computer to each family. The challenge, of course, is that there are families that have, more than one child. And so it's difficult to share a device if you're a parent with 3 or 4 kids at Avon Avenue School. And there are several families that have, certainly more than one child. And so Mike Rowe learns about Charity's effort along with her team, and learns that there are about 125 computers short of every kid getting a Chromebook. And so he brings Charity on his show, and he surprises her by saying that he's going to donate $25,000 to allow every kid at Avon to get a computer. And you'll see the computers in the left of the photo, they're stacked on the ground. So this is the day the computers came. And then Charity and her team quickly delivered those computers. It's a beautiful moment. The show is called Returning the Favor. If you need some inspiration, I encourage you to watch. I think now nearly 5 million people have watched it. Beautiful. It's inspirational, tears. I mean, it's amazing. And it's inspirational work that so many are doing. They're educators like my wife, like her colleagues across this state, right? I mean, they're doing the Lord's work for real, but they're acting as heroes. This is heroic work being led by heroes. But one challenge quickly emerged after Charity and her team delivered computers to every kid. So now 561 kids have computers. So they've got the world's most powerful device in their laps. But we quickly learned that a good number of her students, we saw this across New Jersey, they didn't have access to, right, the internet. So though they now have these computers, they don't have internet access, so they can't get online for online learning. And so parents begin to use their cell phones as hotspots, but they ran out of data. It's very expensive, as folks know, to increase data plans. And so that was not a long-term solution. And so then came the real challenge of thinking about how you get kids internet. There were deals worked out with cable companies that, you know, provided internet for a month or two, but after which a contract was required to be entered into, and it's been a substantial challenge. And you'll remember I share with you that New Jersey is right now investing $300,000 to incarcerate primarily Black and brown kids, $300,000. And kids are right now being required to learn at home online without the benefit of the thing that allows it to be so, internet. And so there have been a number of stopgap measures to try to get kids internet. I will say to you, to put it charitably, it's been a real challenge. And so that's part of what I lift that story up, because part of the challenge is that in crisis moments like these that expose the cracks in our foundation, we very often respond with programs, or we rely on the heroism of people like Charity or her team. And Charity will tell you that heroism is not a replacement for a system. That systems ought to be designed to empower communities. And every community has heroes, to be sure, but heroes are a supplement to an existing system. Other communities have systems that work, and they also have heroes. Too often in communities like ours, we rely on heroic acts, a heroic mayor, a heroic superintendent, a heroic cast of principals, a heroic cast of teachers. But ultimately what they will all tell you, what these heroes will tell you, is that they need systems to support communities in good times, and especially in crisis moments like these. And Maya, if you would turn to the next slide. I share with you, with permission, this is a photo of two of Charity students who received the computers. And, you know, my wife were here, if she were talking to you, she would tell you, you can have a lot of reactions to this photo. But my wife would say is what this photo captures for her is the indomitable spirit of her young scholars, and how they're beyond resilient, right? That they have fashioned for themselves a table, they move the computers to the window, so they get access to the internet from a neighbor. And she would say, if you look at the young man on the right, the yellow shirt, his posture suggests that he could be a dancer. She sees like in him, you can even see his beautiful, so the way he's sitting, he could be a dancer. And the other one is erect. He could have a desk job as a lawyer, so he could do something like that. Just a real discipline the way he's seated. But she would say to you that this is a picture of the spirit that is in her young people who fight against odds. But she would also say to you that what they deserve are systems in place that empower them, so they don't have to express what is often required of them, which is an unreasonable amount of resilience to do what kids across New Jersey are doing right now as you and I are having this conversation, learning at home. The final slide of mine, if you would advance to it, is, you know, this has been on my mind a lot. I know it's been on your mind a lot. The passing of John Lewis, right? John Lewis, as you all know, served as a congressman in Georgia for many, many years. He is someone I met at my previous place of employment where I worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He passed away in the last week, and I had a chance 5 years ago to join him in this spot. This is in Selma, Alabama. John Lewis led a reenactment of the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You all know the story well. It was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge now 55 years ago when a young John Lewis, along with 600 other peaceful protesters, including Amelia Boynton, who's in the wheelchair holding President Obama's hand in this photo, they marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which connects Selma and Montgomery, to dramatize to the world their desire to finally have access to the right to vote. And what I find fascinating about this particular photo is it speaks to what John Lewis did over a lifetime, which is crossing bridges, recognizing that on the other side of the bridge lies opportunity. And so I joined in one of the greatest privileges of my life. I joined the president and John Lewis and Amelia Boynton and really civil rights legends on this bridge for the 50th anniversary reenactment of the Bloody Sunday March. And as John Lewis did 50 years earlier on the original march, when we got to the top here, he paused and he told us about how it was at this spot when they came across the bridge for the original march, they stopped and thought about how they were going to pray. And he says, but before they could get to their knees, they were brutalized by Alabama state troopers. And his skull was fractured by the baton of one of the Alabama state troopers. He talked about experiencing police brutality then. And I think a lot about how that police brutality persists to this day, right, to this moment. And he talked about how he, in that moment, when he was being beaten for democracy, he was imagining an America that didn't yet exist, but that would, but that had to, and that his sacrifice on that bridge would make it so. And so he talked about how what awaited him on the other side of the bridge was the vote, and then he said, was Barack Obama. And I share this picture with you because if you see just in the front of the photo, the woman in the light blue dress is Amelia Boynton. In this photo, she was over 100 years old. Amelia Boynton was beaten unconscious on that bridge. Amelia Boynton is holding President Obama's hand, and to President Obama's left is John Lewis. And what is fascinating for me is that when John Lewis, 50 years earlier, was on that bridge being beaten for democracy along with Amelia Boynton, they could not have imagined that within one generation of this march, the country would elect its first Black president. To imagine that would have required them to have a vision that allowed them to see beyond which the physical eye could see to what would be. And this bridge, called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, is named after a Grand Wizard of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. So this story sort of tells itself, right? A march over a bridge named after a KKK Grand Wizard from Alabama led to the Voting Rights Act being passed within less than a year. And within one generation after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, America elects its first Black president, more than 10,000 Black elected officials across the country. And that started with a march over a bridge. And of course, John Lewis passed away. He marched over his final bridge, right? Some have said. He passed away at this moment. He passed away as we're in the throes of the coronavirus pandemic. He passed away as we're fighting. So thousands of people across this country are energized around creating a kind of police force that has never existed, transforming policing. He passed away in the throes of the racial disparities I shared, and he passed away ahead of one of the most consequential elections in a generation. And I've been thinking a lot about the timing of this, right? His passage. And I think it's because in 80 years, he crossed more bridges than are reasonable to pass for an individual. and he summons us to cross the next set of bridges. That is our charge. We have seen that staircase of challenges, racial disparities lay bare those challenges in every direction here in New Jersey. And that is for us, that's our bridge to cross. Because on the other side of that is a new foundation that we build that's free of cracks, that empower all people in communities like ours. And so I thank you, NRBP, for hosting this DEI series. I'm excited to have had this chance to talk to you here. And I welcome comments, questions, feedback. Thanks again, Chip, Barbara, and Maya for hosting us.
Ryan, that was fantastic. Thank you. Really gets us thinking about how we help to build that bridge, the next bridge to come. We have a number of questions. I'm just going to go in the order that they were posed. The first one has to do with that statistic that you talked about, where you said that the gentleman in the audience had challenged you. And you mentioned prosperity now as being the source of it. But the question before you said that was, what was the source of the statistics? And was any of this done in conjunction with a university or a college?
Yeah, great. So great question. So that comes from, so our most recent report is Erasing New Jersey's Red Lines. It tells a story that I laid out about sort of where New Jersey's racial wealth gap originates. So our theory of change here at the Institute is we do really deep community organizing, understand what some of the challenges are that people in our urban centers, people of color face. And then we do our own really intense research and writing here in-house. We've got a dynamic team of lawyers, of professors, professionals who do research and writing in-house, and then we take what we've learned directly from communities and from our own research and writing, and we put it into reports, white papers, reports, op-eds, data sheets, and then we use the lived experiences of people in communities and our research and writing to advocate. And so the goal really is that through advocacy, we change systems, practices, policy. We fill in the cracks in our foundation in a way that returns resources through change policies back to the communities where we started. So a lot of the work is really intense on the research and the writing. I will share with you, my colleague Andrea McChristian, put her lower back into this report, which has almost 200 footnotes. So we take the numbers very seriously. We take the research and writing very seriously. I encourage you to take a look at our website. You'll find this and other reports on the website there.
And Ryan, after this, we'll circulate the name of that publication specifically, so if people want to be able to access it, they'll be able to do so. Second question is, someone was saying that they couldn't read the top step and wondered what the top step was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mike, can you go back to
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, yeah, that's a fair point. So that one is that New Jersey, that's the 6th in the nation, is around the highest percentage of segregated neighborhood. So that statistic says that New Jersey is 6th in the nation for having the most segregated communities. And so, I'm glad you focused us on that, because, you often don't think about New Jersey in those terms, since we're the 2nd most racially diverse state in the country, but we're also the 6th most segregated state in the country. And I'll give you one anecdote to support that data point. So we interact quite a bit with schools, in part because, as I mentioned, my wife is the principal of a school here. She has taught, this is her 25th year teaching in the city of Newark, in the South Ward. She taught for 9 years at Burgaw Avenue School as a classroom teacher. She taught for 5 years as the vice principal at Chancellor Avenue School, and this will now be her 12th year as the principal of Avon Avenue School. So 25 years of teaching, 3 schools, thousands of children in Newark South Ward. She's never had a white student. Never had a white student. ever. And that is not unique to her. Just really, she could talk to any number of her colleagues who also never had white students. Now, I don't lift that up to suggest that Black students can't learn in all Black environments. It's not at all. But I think one thing we have learned about school education or education is that very often resources follow white children. And so part of the Brown versus the Board of Education litigation in 1954 was based upon that recognition that if you wanted to equalize resources, if you want to provide equal quality of opportunity, you had to integrate schools. Well, we have 60 years after Brown, we now confront schools that are more intensely segregated by race than they were when the Brown decision was decided in 1954. And so I think that speaks to the work that we have to do in the education space, the work that we have to do in integrating our schools. There, actually, I'll share this quickly. There was a case filed by one of our board members, Elise Body. It's a challenge to the law that requires kids go to school in the area where they live. And New Jersey's constitution is very, very strong in its prohibition of school segregation. And you see that step at the top. New Jersey has the sixth worst segregation in the country. And so on its face, the way we operate schools is unconstitutional. That is a case that is being litigated now. I think it's a very good chance of success on the merits. Certainly want to watch. The case is Latino Action Network and NAACP versus New Jersey.
I have to apologize. I've been trying two different phones, and both of the phones seem to be affected by the storm. So I'm hoping it's coming through as clearly as possible. Ryan, just a comment on that. I have spoken at length to my nieces who grew up in relatively wealthy suburbs, and I know for a fact from talking to them that there were essentially no minority students in their classes, and they had not had the opportunity to experience working, well, I shouldn't say working, but going to school in a diverse population. And one of my nieces went to school in New Hampshire and found a similar experience, and just now having moved to Boston and shortly to Texas, she's getting a more diverse perspective. But they all have been talking about it, and I'm heartened by the fact that these young people that are in their 20s are really giving a lot of serious consideration and doing reading. It makes me happy. The next question.
Can I credit your point really quickly? Because I talked a bit about how this is a painful moment, but it's also a precious moment. So one thing that's precious about this moment is, the activism we see being led by young people across the country, right? So when Dr. King is assassinated, there are protests in hundreds of cities across the country. When George Floyd is killed by the police, there are protests in thousands of cities across the country. So I do think there has been this awakening. I think folks are focused on these issues in ways that we haven't been in prior moments. And I think, as with all social movements, to your point, Barbara, young people are really leading the charge. And I do think that portends in a very promising way to the sort of what lies ahead with respect to work on these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And they're reading too, which I find really, really good. They want to understand. So I'm heartened by that. The next question is about charities program, Returning the Favor. If you would, after the program, we'd like to have a link for that because some people want to be able to watch that. The next one, well, really you answered because you said that you do a lot of your research yourself. What is the annual cost of keeping a person in jail for 1 year?
I don't know offhand. So for the adult population, I don't know that number offhand. I'm more familiar with the youth number, but the annual cost of adults, I'm not sure. I will say that New Jersey recently borrowed $10 billion, right, to plug a hole in our budget. And what's fascinating about that reality is that nearly every line item in New Jersey's budget was impacted, right? I mean, if your state is upside down $10 billion, you would imagine that every line item is impacted. That is true except for the criminal justice budget. That was untouched, both in the adult and the youth system. And so I think part of the recognition, even in this moment, is, you know, if you make deep investments in incarceration, you will see the kinds of racial disparities we see. You'll see the kind of incarceration rates you see. But if you make deep investments on the front end, you won't see the same kind of expansion, deep footprint of the criminal justice system. Part of our advocacy has been around that, particularly in the youth justice context.
Okay, the next one is Newark considered to be a smart city with internet access to all? And is there such a designation?
Yeah, so I think, you know, it's funny, before we came on live, Chip and I were talking about how he's in his office, I'm in mine. Internet is fantastic. We're like, downtown is wired for some of the, like, we have some of the best wiring for internet probably in the Northeast, but it just gets questionable in the neighborhood. So there are neighborhoods in the city which are Wi-Fi dead spots, which is what, you know, my wife's experience with her students evidenced, and other students. So I think, you know, we really have to think about how we make investments. Look, it should be the case in 2020 that every community is wired for Wi-Fi, whether or not you can afford a contract with Verizon or Optimum, particularly for those families that can't. And in particular, when we're in the throes of a pandemic that's requiring kids to learn at home. If we can make investments of $300,000 per kid for each year of incarceration, we certainly can make investments that provide Wi-Fi in communities that don't have it. Now kids are using hotspots, right? So some of the cable companies have donated hotspots, but that's not a system. That's like a response to a crisis moment. That isn't something that endures beyond the crisis moment. I think while we're in it, we should think about how we empower communities so that the next time we're confronting a crisis, we'll be better equipped to face it down. Barbara, I think you're on mute.
I was, yeah, I didn't want any background noise. Thank you. There's two more points. One is just a comment, just thanking you for all your discussion about Congressman Lewis and the bridges that he crossed during his lifetime and how we're on the precipice of crossing additional bridges. It's just a terrific analogy. Someone says they just logged on because of a work commitment, and I can answer this question for everybody. That the person wanted to know if this would be available for later viewing, and I believe that we are recording, so we will, in the thank you email, we'll make the link to the recording available. And if anybody has missed it totally, we'll be able to have them listen via that link. The final comment is excellent, thank you, and I couldn't agree more. Now it's my pleasure to turn back to Chip. And Ryan, you really just set us off on such a great footing for the rest of our conversation and also to inform our work going forward. So we can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thanks
Chip?
for having me.
Thanks, Barbara. Ryan, before we go, I got a question for you that I'd like to pose. And, you know, you talked about a lot of systemic things that we need more than a couple of us to handle. That's got to be done by our elected officials. That brings into question voting rights, and as successful as the Voting Rights Act was 55 years ago, it hasn't made as much progress as we'd like to think. Acknowledging that, on the other side of it, we've got 100 or so people on this webinar. What can individuals do to further the cause of eliminating some of these cracks in the foundation?
Yeah, Chip, great question. So, look, I'm mindful that I'm talking to the business community. This is the heart of the engine of Newark, and we rely on the business community to be that engine. I think, right now, those numbers I shared are pre-coronavirus numbers, right? I didn't have the heart to update those. But you can imagine that those disparities have worsened. And so, I think, the thing that comes to mind is, maintaining a commitment to hire locally, to support people in the city who rely on work from the business community and to rely on work to feed their families, rely on work from the business community to reverse some of those staggering trends, ultimately to help to build wealth. So I think that's the first thing is, an inclusive business community that hires locally, that prioritizes that sets measures in place. We think about bottom lines a lot, particularly in terms of like gains and losses. I think this moment teaches us that we should also think about numbers in terms of who we employ and how we employ, particularly local residents. The other thing is there's sort of a broader sort of effort to empower communities. So the mayor for the last years convened a working group of folks, a number of them from folks on this line, our organization, around creating a universal basic income. It's something Dr. King talked about when he came to Newark more than 50 years ago. You know the story. He came to Newark. He talked about the Poor People's Campaign. The heart of it was the guaranteed income to help eliminate poverty. And then he went to Memphis 8 days later and he was assassinated there. But while he was here, he was really thinking about, we sort of careen from crisis to crisis. But how do we, in the heart of a crisis, think about protecting against future crises? And poverty has been an intractable one. Supporting something like a guaranteed income pilot in Newark would be really, I think, really, really important. And the final thing I'll say is, I share with you all the 10 things you can do to advocate for racial justice document. A number of those things are policy things. Those are things individuals can do. But companies very often have a lobbying arm, right? A lot of our work is around public policy and legislative advocacy. Companies can stand with us very powerfully to change policies. I'll say this last piece, Chip. So some years ago, we stood with a number of folks in the line in PSE&G to champion Ban the Box, right? Really powerful piece of legislation that sought to make it easier for people with criminal convictions to get access to employment. That kind of work continues. That document I share lays out several things that can be done. We love to partner with businesses and companies around advancing a public policy and legislative strategy that begins to really fill in some of those cracks that we talked a bit about, Chip.
Thanks, Ryan. And thank you for joining us today and all the good work you do. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Quest Diagnostics and Kerry for your support of this series, and we certainly look forward to the subsequent programs. A lot has been said over the last couple of weeks about John Lewis, and I watched a TED Talks interview that was done with him, and at the end of the interview, he was asked, how would you like people to remember you? And he said, like to remember that I helped to save people and move people to a different and better sense of humanity. And bottom line is that's something we could all aspire to. So thank you for your inspiration today, Ryan. Thank you all for joining us. We hope that you join us for the rest of this series and all the other programs that we try to bring value to our members and to enhance the Newark community. So with that, Ryan, thanks again. Great to see you.